Welcome back. My guest is Guy Martin. He's the open source community manager at CollabNet. CollabNet is involved with Forge.mil, which is the Department of Defense's open source Forge. I think there's some order of 10,000 people, members of it now, and around 500 projects?
Right, we're at 10,000 users for Forge.mil today, and we're a little over 550 projects if you count both our internal SourceForge.net-like environment, Software Forge, the free and internally available, and also the private Project Forge instance, which is applying the same sort of open source principles, but for private projects.
So this is open source development happening behind the firewall, right?
Right,
okay.
Right. So it's jokingly, we kind of say it's inner sourcing or community sourcing, so it's applying the same principles that make open source work outside of the firewalls to internal projects.
This isn't something that I think the larger community always thinks about or sees because it's obviously hidden.
Right.
There's a defense context that makes some sense. How is open source methodology or software changing how the DoD works and collaborates?
Well, I think it's affecting everything from the way IT acquisition happens, and there's been some work that happened, HR 2647, Section 804, which really sort of required the Secretary of Defense to start developing a more open, collaborative, agile, if you will, approach to IT acquisition and development. That has been an outgrowth of what we've built with Forge.mil, and it's really started to make people in the DoD realize that they need to do a better job of collaborating on sort of infrastructure pieces, or we said earlier today, the cursor over target program, right? Everybody doesn't need to develop the cursor over target software. It just, that should be a base level that people then, different services can build upon for their unique needs, as opposed to reinventing that for every single program and every single DoD entity. And
that's often one of the value propositions for open source, right? The replicability, as they say. Now that leads me to one of these acronyms that I could get lost in, so spell it out. The Defense Common Ground Station Integrated Backbone. The DoD loves acronyms.
Right.
So what is the DIB project and how does it relate to what you just described?
Right. So I can give you a very high level of what DIB is. The folks that are running DIB are basically trying to create a common backbone for ground systems interchange for the ground systems targeting pieces. And I probably got that wrong, so I apologize to the DIB guys in advance. But they're basically doing exactly what we just talked about. They're trying to make sure that they don't reinvent that infrastructure for every single service. So what happens is there's a DIB, a Defense Common Ground Systems Integration Backbone. It's a mouthful. And then there's individual DCGS projects for each of the services that build upon that common layer. So think about it in the model of Linux, right? Almost like adding device drivers or pieces on top of a common operating system for ground systems, if you will. So
it's small pieces loosely joined, as they say.
Yes, exactly.
Same philosophy. Well, how is that actually changing how the DoD is working towards its warfighting and then a larger picture, its acquisition? Do you see more adoption of open source technology coming in?
Well, look, the DoD uses a lot of open source as it is today, right? I mean, they're a big user of Linux. There's even in the slightly sister organization Intelligence, and NSA did a lot of work, obviously, with SE Linux. So there's definitely a precedent there for using open source. I think contributing back to it is a separate problem, which we're really not trying to solve in Forge.mil, but we are trying to get people to come in and say, hey, how do we do a better job of utilizing all those best practices in open source that make it successful, and do a better job of getting the talent base that we have not only inside of DoD but in the contractor space to come in and really understand how they do that. And honestly, it's a cultural change. Not only, I think a lot of the software development folks that are used to open source, and you're starting to see more and more as the generation shift, right? In these DoD contractors, you're starting to see more and more people that have grown up in open source, right, and are used to using it. It's really still a matter of changing, just like I said, the acquisition policy as well as the culture for how intellectual property is defined and sort of how you figure out what you bring to the table in terms of innovation.
One of the things that you have to look at in the modern warfighting is certainly a mobile workforce, right?
Absolutely.
Defines that.
Absolutely.
And so in that context, thinking through what the future of software is going to be like, Android seems to factor into that.
Android factors in. Army's doing a lot of work in Android and also in iPhone. As a matter of fact, Forge.mil hosted something called the Apps for Army Challenge, and that was put together by the Army G6 organization. And they basically hosted a contest, essentially, to come up with applications that the warfighter could use on smartphones. And so we hosted the development of that. People posted their code there, and that code is still there for people to come back and utilize. And we'd like to see more things like that happen. I think that's sort of capturing the ethos of the open source world in getting warfighters who are really the subject matter experts in a lot of this to come in and start doing that development.
So that seemed to turn a lot of what I understand of DoD procurement or acquisition on its head a little bit, because you're actually creating the applications internally. One of the things I've heard from people who are involved in that is if you can't hack it, don't pack it, right?
Right.
So how does that open source ethos extend to the battlefield in that context?
I mean, it happens today, right? I mean, one of the folks from Red Hat who was a reservist, there was a great example of he built a Wi-Fi in an ammo can and used that for, through open source technologies, Asterisk I think actually he used, and used that to extend the range of his handheld walkie-talkies because he couldn't get all the way back to base station. So it happens today. I think the real question is, how do you take those types of things and make them sustainable so that when that person transfers out of the field, that knowledge isn't lost? And to a certain degree, so there's that edge development that happens, and that's kind of the open source ethos. In Forge.mil, we'd actually like to marry that. A lot of people have accused Forge.mil of trying to centralize that and stifle innovation, and it's actually the exact opposite. We want people to go develop that stuff at the edge if possible, but just find a way to bring it back into something like Forge.mil so that other people can benefit from that and not have that be just an isolated incident, or worse, have people building that same thing over and over again in the field.
Now, last question. You touched on this earlier, this question of how and where the open source community can collaborate with the Department of Defense, where and if code can be contributed back in, contributing code back out.
Right.
That's his classic distributed model. What are the prospects for a Forge.gov, so to speak?
So a Forge.gov, I've actually commented on this quite a bit in blogs and other forums, and Gunnar Hellickson from Red Hat and I have had a long discussion about this. I think that needs to happen, and the real question is sort of what the contribution model would be from the open source side. I think, you look at Forge.mil, it's protected by firewalls and strong authentication because we're solving a problem of internal collaboration, whereas a Forge.gov probably would have two variants, right? A variant where maybe intra-agency collaboration or interagency collaboration, and then also collaboration with the greater open source community. Maybe Forge.gov has one component that's internal, and then one that's more of a freshmeat.net style piece that lists where there are collaborations going on in SourceForge.net or GitHub or other places.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's Guy Martin. He's the community manager for CollabNet, I should say.
CollabNet.
All right. I want to say Collab.net, but it's a little
our URL is Collab.net, so yeah, you're close.
It is. All right. That's great. Thank you very much for your time.